I'm very delighted to do this session. I'm particularly delighted to see that there are some people who have signed up who I know quite well. I'm thinking of Greg and Dennis, for example, but for the rest of you who I haven't met before, thank you very much for joining us today. This is very much a personal view. I'm not going to give an overview of the field of scholarly research at all. I'm going to give a personal view of some of the developments in my own work over time, including its strengths and its limitations, and the way the work has developed over time, and particularly pointing to the importance of team working in this kind of research, which is quite complex and very demanding from an empirical point of view. I would say one of the important things I've learned about doing this research is that how much more you can deliver by working in teams as distinct from working on your own. And that may not be, of course, possible for all of you immediately to do that, but certainly team working is a very, very important part of the process of learning in doing the kind of field work that I've done over time. So that's my opening thought. And if we could move on and have a look at the second slide, which will give you an idea of what I'm going to do today. I think my first step is to offer some definitions of what I mean by process scholarship, and of course early on to indicate why it matters, why this kind of research is important to conduct, why it started in the way it did, I think, in the 70s and 80s, and what was the nature of the field in the 70s and 80s, which made the kind of work I'm going to describe necessary and important. I'll talk about some of the early studies I've done, particularly my PhD, which was published as the Politics of Organizational Decision Making, and the book that followed it, The Awakening Giant, which is a 10-year study of ICI. And I'll point to the strengths but also the limitations of those studies, and why those limitations had to be dealt with in the second, if you like, a second cycle of work, which I'll mention under section 5. But before I do that, I want to, since I'm originally trained as a sociologist myself, to mention a tradition of sociological scholarship which is highly processual and is very important to the kind of background and to the significance of this tradition. And it's the work which has been developed by Andrew Abbott, who is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. His work may not necessarily be known by everyone, and I wanted to highlight his work as a parallel tradition of process scholarship, which certainly I've learned a great deal from, and is very important in terms of my own development. Then moving on from that, the idea then is to having dealt with some of the limitations of the earlier work as well as some of the strengths of it, to talk about picking up some big themes, the much bigger themes which followed in the work I did in the 80s and 90s, and how the importance of teams of scholarship, how the importance of teams allowed that work to happen. And I'll mention some of the issues about the development of teams, and of course the key issues about funding them over long periods of time. And I'll conclude that section, under number 6, by talking about again, some of the challenges and benefits of process scholarship. And finally, if there's time, and I'm not sure there will be time, there's the most recent work I've done is been changing the level of analysis and trying to examine system-wide change from a process point of view. And I see system-wide change as archetypical of the crucial problems today, which are not just studying institutions or organizations, but studying systems of systems. And there's one piece of research I've done there with 2 colleagues in the north of Ireland and also at Cranfield, who I'll mention later. And our first piece of writing in this area has used the Northern Ireland conflict and peace process as a rare example of a successful system-wide change, at least successful for a time. So that's where I'm going. If we could move on to the first definition, which is the definition I'm offering here for what I mean by process scholarship. And I think the words speak for themselves. And there's no point of me reading them out to you now. If you can just see some of the key words in there representing, I think, the direction I'm going. Moving on to the next slide, which is number 4. This is really the sort of the leitmotif of my work, the idea of catching reality in flight and in context. So one is always interested in movement, in dynamics, in fact, using gerunds, if you like, rather than nouns. So the interest is in changing, not just in change, in leading, and not just in leadership. So we seem to have missed the 4th slide. I don't know why, but the 4th, there it is. It's finally come up. So that was what I've just been describing to you, and as the leitmotif, if you like, of my own work. And moving on to number 5, here are some of the generic process questions, which I think are basic to any kind of process analysis. Starting with, of course, the crucial significance of antecedent questions and antecedent conditions. Certainly in my own work, I've tried to pioneer the importance of historical analysis, and recognizing that, of course, history is not just about the past, that the past is alive in the present and is shaping the emergent future. So one is always interested in the relationship between the past and the present and the future. And with that, the importance of antecedent questions in any kind of analysis. So, and I think historical analysis also has that crucial pragmatic benefit for a process scholar. If one was just studying processes in real time, of course, you would be limited by our capacity to do that. You'd be capturing a very small, as it were, real-time analysis. Few people could have their research funded for 3 or 5 years. So if all you could do in process studies is to study things as they were emerging, it would be very difficult to do that. Although I have done it, I've done studies which have lasted for 10 years. So if you have a retrospective analysis and a historical analysis, you can add the retrospective analysis with the real-time analysis and generate, as we have done, a time series of 30 more years or more. So antecedent questions and historical analysis are pragmatically crucial, I think, in conducting the kind of scholarship that I'm addressing here, as well as being crucial in themselves in theoretical terms, or the development of processual type theories. I think the other key questions are, of course, are about context, that processes are always to be examined across levels of context. And the levels of context, I, of course, have dealt with our within firm analysis, whole firm analysis, relationship between the firm and the sector, and the relationship between the firm, the sector, and the economy. So one is always trying to locate processes in their context. It's a form of embedded analysis. It's one of the principles of process scholarship that one wants to deal with about processes embedded in contexts. So the relationship between actions and contexts in historical in historical terms is very important. Of course, the process scholars are also interested in evolution and development questions. They're interested in sequencing questions. Why does this follow that? They're certainly interested in pace questions. And I think this is one of the probably novel things we did in some of our earlier research. In fact, the study that I did with Ewan Furley and Lorna McKee in the National Health Service was one of the first studies to look at variation in the pace of change. Why is it that people trying to achieve the same change objective, there is very considerable differences in the pace with which that change was achievable? So process scholars are also crucially interested in pace. And finally, and this was missing I would say in the earlier work we did, there's a necessity, or ideally, to look at output questions. What are the outcomes that processes are able to achieve? And what is the relationship between variations in context, variations in action, and the delivery of outcomes from processes? And I think having an outcome variable is a major benefit in any process study. And I'll give you some illustrations of that as we get into my talk. So those are all absolutely critical building blocks, if you like, for the conduct of a process analysis. Moving on to some examples of process studies. I mean, these are the ones I've done myself. As I said, I'm concentrating here on very much my own work, not extending this work, of course, to some of the other very important process scholars in the field. I mean, Henry Mintzberg, just as a sidetrack for a moment, but of course, the other key process scholars in my terms who have been important, whose work I can't dwell on today, but obviously crucial, are Henry Mintzberg, Andrew van der Ven, Robert Bergelman, and more recently Anne Langley and Haridimas Sukas and Robert Chia. So there are many varieties of process analysis and process studies, and I think I'm going to concentrate, for reasons of based of time and also to deal with this in some depth, by concentrating just on my own work. So these are the sort of questions that I've pursued in process terms. And you can see the processes I've looked at have been decision-making processes, power processes, culture change and development processes, strategic change processes, leadership and change processes, and of course, latterly, if there's time, I'll try and deal with it, the whole question about system-wide changes and how do they occur. So moving on to number 7, empirical research on change and decision-making change in the 1970s. But this is basically what I found when I started my own work on decision-making, since the decision-making process and political processes were the key parts of my PhD. That work started in '66 and finished in the '70s. And it was very clear then that the amount of process work going on was very limited indeed. The unit of analysis in so much work at that time was the change episode or the decision episode. So that people were picking decisions, processes, or decision episodes out of their temporal context, out of their historical context, so the studies were largely atemporal, they were largely ahistorical, they were largely aprocessual, and they're largely acontextual. So this was in a sense, the inheritance, which my context in which my work started, and Henry Mintzberg's work started, which was approximately around the same time in the late '60s and early '70s. So it was an era, in other words, where social scientists appeared to have no time for time. And the work that was going on was atemporal, highly episodic, and in its focus. And this was a huge limitation, if you like, in terms of our inability to understand how things were happening, as distinct from what was happening. And of course, one wants to understand both what is happening as a process scholar, how it is happening as a process scholar, when is it happening, and of course, these things are all very, very important indeed. Moving on to number 8, just to give you some two early studies which I've already mentioned, but just to give some emphasis to them. The first was my PhD, published in the Politics of Organizational Decision Making and reprinted in 2001. And the second one, of course, was the big study of ICI. I mean, these studies exemplify some of the things I was trying to emphasize. The Politics of Organizational Decision Making started off as a study of a single computer purchase decision in a single company, and it very quickly became apparent that the way that the context for this decision I studied and its processes were intimately connected with the way that 2 other previous decisions had been made about buying computers in that particular company. So in other words, there was a very clear temporal link and historical link between the processes. And if one wanted to understand the ones I was studying in real time, one had to study the way that things had played out in historical time. And that work also, of course, examined the legitimization of ideas and the politics of legitimization of ideas in decision-making, and the way that those ideas were not just shaped by power and politics, but were shaped by the culture of the organization that the decisions were taking. And so that was the first attempt to do this kind of work. The second was the ICI study, which was a huge study in terms of it took 10 years to conduct this work. And it was a very rare thing to happen. I mean, I think probably many people would argue that kind of work couldn't be done today because people wouldn't have the time to do it, given the demands on people for publishing rapidly today. But of course, I did publish while that work was going on. I didn't wait till the end, to the 1985 work before something was published. It was published. It was possible to publish to some degree while the work was going on. But the historical analysis. The real-time nature of the study, by the way, was carried out between 1975 and 1982. And then I did a historical analysis, which went back to 1960. And it was comparative, looking at the continuity and change in ICI in 5 of its key divisions and in the corporate headquarters. And I think the other important thing about that study was that it proved, and people were very skeptical about this time, it could prove that it was possible for social scientists to get into elite institutions in British society. And slowly over a period of time, I was able to work from input into the personnel departments in the divisions, right up to the main board of the company. And it demonstrated that it was possible to get access to elite institutions in British society. And of course, I subsequently went on to achieve that in other places. Now, I think this is very important. It's also very important if you're publishing work to try and hold on to the proper name of the company, i.e. to be allowed to publish the name of Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI as it was abbreviated in those days, rather than trying to hide it under some pseudonym like Chemco or something nonsensical like that. So I would recommend, if you're doing this work, to always try and negotiate the right to use the proper name of the company. It's worth doing that because it's a huge attention director for the work when it eventually gets published. And it is possible to achieve that if you do it in the right kind of contractual way with companies, although it's some companies more difficult than others. So these were early studies. And but moving on to my own work, moving on to the next slide, here I want to introduce the work of Andrew Abbott. And he's famous for me in terms of his critique of what he calls the variables paradigm. And if you read that phrase, which I've taken from one of his 1992 publications, you can see what he's saying about the weaknesses of the variables paradigm. The variables paradigm either focus on variables as fixed entities with variable qualities. In this kind of work, that causality is attributed to the variables rather than to the actors in the situation. In other words, variables are said to do things, not social actors. That stories disappear in the variables paradigm. And the only narratives present in such methods are, as he puts it, just so stories justifying this or that relationship between the variables. So his critique of the variables paradigm was the first thing that drew my attention to his work, because I was behaving that kind of critique in the work I was doing myself at the time. And if we move on to the next quotation, you'll see that his base point there, that the variables paradigm has led to real actors being replaced by variables, narrative causality by the reified causality of variables, real time by the order of the variables. And the classic way this work was presented was by not just positing variables which had to be measured and most often not correlated with other variables, But even when the independent and dependent variables were used in the analysis, again, it was primarily correlation analysis, which was sought to try and establish causal links between the independent variables and the dependent variables. So I was very attracted by this work. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see where his most recent work is published. And if you want to see where that is, the book I would recommend is a book called Processual Sociology, published by University of Chicago Press in 2016. Andrew Abbott has been a professor at Chicago in the sociology department all his career. And this is his most up-to-date and comprehensive treatment of his ambitious scholarship. And I mentioned the Morgan Jouvenet publication, which was, of course, originally published in French, but can be easily found now translated into English. Just by going on the internet, you can find this. The advantage, of course, of reading the Morgan Jouvenet paper first is that it gives you a simplified interpretation of Abbott's work and compares it with other forms of scholarship historically. So I really recommend those of you who are really interested in process scholarship and who want to read beyond organizational theory or strategy or management to really look at Andrew Abbott's work. And if you move on, you can see that to slide number 12, you can see that he sees himself very much as a narrative positivist. And those are some of his work is very surprisingly positivistic in its orientation, while at the same time holding on to this crucial concern for narrative and for process. And I would really recommend that you read that work. Moving on to slide 13, you can hear are some of the contributions that emerged from the earlier work I did. That it was, first of all, a challenge to the acontextual, aprocessual, ahistorical research on strategy and change. Secondly, that it tried to catch reality in flight and in context. Thirdly, that there was a great focus on the relationship between context, content, process, and time, and I'll illustrate that in a moment with a simple diagram. Fourthly, there was an attempt to produce new standards for case study research. You'll see in a moment some of the research that I'm going to describe, which was nearly all done in teams. It was altogether much more demanding and bigger in scale than what many people were using for the nature of a case study, where for many people, a case study was going in and interviewing 8 or 10 people often, and a very minimalist form of exploration. So I think in our work, as you'll see in a moment, it was altogether different from that in terms of its breadth and its intensity and its demands. And of course, this did require teams to do the work rather than individuals. Of course, it also signaled the value of the historical perspective and method, the value and importance of political, cultural views of process, of course, the significance of power in delivering and preventing change. And I think this was an undertreated notion. I think probably European scholarship is much more interested, much more aware, much more capable and interested in the use of power than in many other social systems where there's a preference often for the much softer term of influence. And of course, all this challenged the linear views of strategy and change, and also at that time began to humanize the emerging field of strategy in precisely the same way, of course, had Henry Mintzberg had done in his own work. So moving on to the framework for analyzing change, this was one of the outputs from the big ICI study on the awakening giant, and I always use this as a starting point, actually not so much from a research perspective, although it is valuable from a research perspective, but when I'm introducing the notion of change to a group of managers, to look at the framework which includes context, plural, the outer and inner context of the firm. Here, the focus here is, of course, on the why of change. I would suggest much of the explanation for about why change occurs is wrapped up in the relationship between the outer and inner context of the firm. And those of you who've read my work will know that the outer context of the firm is well delineated in the analysis, as is the inner context. The outer context, of course, referring much to the economic and competitive environment, to the technological environment, and the market environment which the firm is located, as well, of course, as its political context. And the inner context related much more to the strategy, structure, culture, and internal politics and power in the firm. So the suggestion is that explore the outer and inner context and the interrelationship between the two over time. Of course, as you can see, the arrows coming out from each side of the corner is the starting point. Secondly, of course, to delineate the what of change, and content is my way of expressing the notion about what. And the suggestion, of course, is that the understanding of the change process will come from the analysis of the interconnection between the inner and outer context of the change, the content of change, and of course the process of change. So these were this was and of course the what of change very much wrapped up in the content analysis, and the how, of course, are very much in the process analysis. So this was the starting point, if you like, for a framework which evolved from that earlier work. Now, moving on, of course, to slide 15. Of course, this, like all work, it was limited. These first two big studies, and I suppose the one limitation was very much wrapped up in the sparse treatment of method underlying the research. There was no attempt at that time, I made no attempt at that time, to really articulate a theory of method for this work, which I subsequently went on to do. I think probably my biggest cited publication for doing this is, I think it's now over 7,000 citations, is a paper called, it's published in Organization Science in 1990. And it's called Longitudinal Field Research on Change, Theory and Practice. So, but at that stage, I hadn't tried to articulate this in terms of a theory of method. So the early work was sparse in its treatment of method. The second limitation of the first set of work was the failure to link context and process to variations in outcome. In other words, there was no dependent variable in those earlier studies. And I think this was a crucial weakness of that earlier work. And I think the next phase of the research tackled these limitations and required much bigger, ambitious research teams, which were enabled by big research teams. And this happened because in 1985, I set up a research center at Warwick University called the Center for Corporate Strategy and Change. And in that center, much of the next cycle of work took place. And if you move on to the next slide, you can see the range of key scholars who worked at the Center for Corporate Strategy and Change at Warwick Business School between 1985 and 2000. So the center lasted for 15 years, which is quite a difficult thing to achieve financially. Even in those days, be just as difficult today. But as you can see, many of these scholars are extremely well known. They joined the center when they were sort of, in some cases, starting their career, in other cases at the middle career. But 13 out of those 20 scholars listed there went on to become full professors at various universities in the United Kingdom and abroad. So I think it benefited their career and their research progress to be part of this group. And as I said to you earlier more than once, I'm a great believer in the power of team working in social science and how much more you can contribute and develop as a team and compared with what is possible on your own, no matter how demanding and hardworking you might be. So big themes require big teams. That's one of my key phrases and one of my key suggestions for those of you who are really ambitious. You want to take a field forward in terms of its development. So moving on to some of the studies that evolved from that team working. This was the first big study. It was part of the Economic and Social Research Council program work on the competitiveness of UK industry. And there were one researcher, one senior research fellow, and myself working on this. 3 of us working on this project. And basically, here you see straight away clearly there's a dependent variable in the study. Why do firms operate? And the key questions were: why do firms operating in broadly similar country and industry and product markets record different performances over time? So in other words, controlling for the industry and the product market, some firms clearly outperform others. So why? That was a key question. And to what extent was the why associated by the contribution of the way they manage strategic operational change to their performance? So this is a very central, if you like, question in industry at that time. And we went on to produce a number of publications, so one of which is listed there, but also a BBC television documentary from this work. And I think that was another thing we recognized, that to get the work across, not just to produce the outputs, but to have some impact, one had to think about outputs way beyond those published in scholarly books or scholarly papers. So that became part of the realpolitik and raison d'etre of the Centre for Corporate Strategy and Change. So moving on to the project history, this work was done between 1985 and 1990 in real time, and it involved comprehensive case studies of 8 firms drawn from 4 sectors of the UK economy. So we picked a consistently high performer and a consistently low performer in each of 4 sectors. Those 4 sectors, and explored why and how the high performers were able to outperform the lesser performers over time. And if you move on to the next slide, which is number 19, you can see that the real-time analysis occurred between 85 and 1990. As the work was done in real time, we were following through these companies as they were developing their competitive performance. And then we went back and did a historical analysis right back to 1960. And this led to 350 recorded interviews in the 8 case studies, which is a huge task. And you can see the difference here between the notion of a case study in this kind of work compared with what was going on in many other case study analysis at that time. And alongside it, of course, there was considerable archival analysis going on over that long period, as well as data collection analysis going on at the firm, the sector, and the economy level. So this was big commitment, and it's hard to imagine. I would say it's impossible for an individual to do that kind of work on their own. That it needed team working to deliver work of that scale and intensity. And what were the key results? If we move on to number 20, slide 20, you'll see these were some of the highlighted results. The first one, of course, was that there's no single key to improving firm performance. It was a multifaceted issue, as you would expect. We also found that firms facing similar economic, political, and institutional contexts did outperform one another. So therefore, explanation for the relative performance of the firm had to go beyond macro level factors to include the strategic and operational management of the firm. And remember at the time, when we took these results to the Department of Trade and Industry at that time, of course, they were purely fixated by macroeconomic explanations of variations in performance, and they were completely ignoring the managerial level factors. So in the way we set up this design, we were able to demonstrate that the firm performance there was not just subject to these macro level features, it was also influenced by these strategic and operational management of the firm. So we did establish a link between performance and the management of change, and we were able to establish very clearly and substantively in terms of data, that the higher and lesser performing firms contrasted sharply in the way they, first of all, understood their environments. Secondly, the way they led change. Thirdly, the way they linked strategic and operational change, and there was a big difference there. Fourthly, the way they managed their human resources, and particularly the way they managed the processes of skill development, because obviously skill development is a crucial factor in building the basis upon which firms can compete. And we were able to draw that out very clearly in comparing the high and the lesser performance. And finally, we were able to show that coherence in the management of a variety of change processes simultaneously was another key factor. That firms sometimes were very good at managing a single change processes, but faced with the challenges of managing multiple change processes, they often did that in a highly incoherent fashion. So this was a much more ambitious sort of project, much more demanding, but nevertheless crucial. And moving on to give you an example now from the public sector. This is slide number 21. This is the work I mentioned earlier in the National Health Service. And one of the things I wanted to do in the centre, again, to increase its visibility, was not just to work in a single sector, i.e. the private sector, but also to work in the public sector. So right from the beginning, we sought to get big grants to study the National Health Service. And this was the first one. And it was a big project which involved Ewan Furley, Lorna McKee, and myself. And you may well know the book, Shaping Strategic Change, the Case of the NHS, which published this work. And so the key questions were, did the top-down changes of the 1980s secure changes at the local district level? If so, why and how? Was there evidence of variability in pace of change in districts facing broadly the same change objectives? And again, if so, why and how? And what mixture of top-down and bottom-up pressures provided momentum and energy for change? And how was any early progress maintained or increased? So again, classically process-type questions, but again, related to an outcome variable. In this case, not a final outcome. The previous study, which shows a final outcome, actually the relative performance of that firm. Here we are choosing an intermediate outcome, which is pace of change, which had been, relatively speaking, hardly studied at all at that time. And this is one of the first empirical studies of pace of change. And moving on to the sample selection, which is the next slide, you can see here again how the work done. Coincidentally, there was 8 case studies again. We chose 8 high change district health authorities, and we looked at 2 service changes in each district. One was an acute care change, and the other was a mental health care change. Again, the work was conducted in real time between 85 and 91, and in retrospective time going right back to the 80s. So we could explore the long-term development of the patterns of change in each of these district health authorities. So an example, for example, of an acute, of a mental health change, there was a program of research going on at that time in Britain to look to close large psychiatric institutions. And what we did was to compare in the same district a psychiatric institution which, say, took 20 years to close down, whereas in a related health psychiatric hospital in the same domain, they were able to close it down in 8 years. So pace of change can be very crucial. I mean, of course, quality of the change process is also crucial, and we try to look at that as well. So what did we find? Well, moving on to this slide number 23, you can see here the argument we found was that we found receptive contexts for change and non-receptive contexts for change. And the receptive contexts were an interconnected set of features of managerial and professional action associated with forward movement to change, and the non-receptive were the opposite. And we found 8 receptive factors which in the high change districts, they included things like of course, the degree of environmental pressure on the health authority. Secondly, the quality and coherence of policy in that domain. Thirdly, key people leading change. Fourthly, the quality of managerial clinical relationships, and so on. So these were all crucial factors which led to this variations in the pace of change. So we explained the variation in pace in terms of these factors of receptivity and non-receptive, and there were these were 8-factor models which will help to explain the variation in pace we found. So this was an example of therefore of pace of change being the intermediate dependent variable, and again a study which was able to connect these things up very effectively. Moving on to the final study, which I've got time to mention. This is quite different in character, but again equally ambitious. And here this study was done as a sort of skeptical critique. We're now, of course, well into the 1990s, and at that time there was a welter of consultancy literature arguing that, or trying to argue, that a key to company performance was firms developing new forms of organizing in the firm, and we were skeptical of this. So this was a big study, again financed by both by the Economic and Social Research Council, and this time also by Coopers and Lybrand. So this was the first time a professor at a UK university had applied for a big research grant to the Economic and Research Council in partnership with a major consultancy firm. Amazingly, this had never happened before. And not only do we get huge benefits from it in terms of financial support, but also access to companies which the consultancy firm opened. But it also, I think, helped our case for getting money from the ESRC, the fact that this work was already being sponsored by and supported by an organization which was concerned with the impact of findings. So what were the 3 questions? Well, these were the three key questions. First of all, the progress questions. How far have these new organizational forms been implemented in the sample of companies we looked at? Second, what were the performance effects of implementing them? This was our question to probe the skepticism we had. And thirdly, the process question: what are the managerial processes of implementing such changes? So this is where this is, and if we turn over to the next slide, you can see the research methods. We did 4 surveys. We surveyed the largest 1,500 companies in the UK, in continental Western Europe, in Japan and the USA, to explore the progress performance questions, and we did 18 case studies, 8 in the UK and 10 in continental Western Europe, to probe the process questions. And of course, this required building an international team of scholars. And the teams included teams of scholars in the UK, of course, ourselves at Warwick, in Sweden, France, Spain, Switzerland, Germany, Japan, and the USA. So it was a very demanding study, this time involving international collaboration, which itself is, of course, demanding. And of course, it also involved the collection of large amounts of quantitative data to go alongside the more qualitative data in the case studies themselves. Well, there's not time for me, if I want to explore the final part of my talk, to get into the details of this. But if you look at yourself the slides that follow, you'll see that we based our work very much on complementarities theory, at least the explanation of performance variation very much on complementarities theory, which was a theory which is developed in industrial economics. And this was possible because we recruited into the team some industrial economists. So again, we were open to the value of interdisciplinary work and interdisciplinary teams. And the industrial economists brought a lot to us in terms of quantitative analysis, because we had to do time series regression analysis on our survey material. But they also brought to us this theory, which none of us were familiar with, but developed by Milgram and Roberts in the economics department at Stanford. And that became a critical theory for explaining the variability in performance that we had. So if we could move on now, actually, to slide number 28. I would like to miss 1 or 2 factors. We move on to number 28. We're getting to my summary points now about what was being attempted. in those studies. What was being attempted in those studies was to link variability of context to process to outcomes. The outcomes were the dependent variables in the studies. So you've got the process scholar has a big choice here, I think. Does one content oneself to describing, analyzing, and explaining some patterns in some focal process, whether the focus is a change process, or whether it's a decision-making process, whether it's a cultural development process, or a power process? Is the objective of the work to look at patterns in some process over time, or does one want to go beyond that and seek to include some outcome variable in the analysis and try to link patterns in the observed context and process to variations in outcome? And this is a big step forward to build an outcome into the analysis. And I would say this is the which made much of the success, I think, of this second generation of work was the attempt to build in this this outcome analysis. If we move on to slide 29, you see this what this challenge is. Is the outcome to produce an intermediate or a final effect in the study? So remember, in the NHS study, the intermediate effect was pace of change. We weren't looking at whether the health systems that we were examining produced better health outcomes. We were only looking at the intermediate effect of whether one was able to achieve the change faster than the other. That's an intermediate effect, which is valuable, can be valuable, but maybe it's much more valuable if you can look at a final effect. And that involves looking at some direct performance variable, where, of course, again, you have a major challenge here is the problem then of assessing or measuring the outcome. Because all outcome studies are contestable, and you have to get smart at anticipating what some of the deficiencies might be in the outcome variable that you're addressing in order to deal with as many as the problems that you possibly can. And finally, of course, there's no point in establishing variations in outcome if you can't explain the variabilities of outcome. And here you had to look at the mechanisms which shape the outcome. So moving on to the next slide, which is about benefits. I think what I'm suggesting here is that the benefits of this kind of work, first of all, the outcome or effect provides a focal point and anchor for the whole investigation. It means when you get up in the morning, you know exactly what you're trying to explain, because you've built into your study some notion of variation. This is a high performer. This is a low performer. This is a fast mover. This is a slow mover. So that outcome variable becomes the anchor for the whole study. There's never any doubt about what the study is all about. This you might think is obvious, but it's a huge advantage. I've seen so many process scholars getting lost in the myriad detail of their work because they don't have a clear explanandum. They don't have a clear thing to explain in their work. So having an outcome variable is a crucial thing from a scientific point of view. Secondly, another thing is that context, process, and outcome studies are attention directors in scholarly and policy arenas. It's a big attention director for your work to have an outcome variable in it. It draws people's attention to it. You mean you think you can explain why there's a variation in this performance of this company, why this one competes better than that one? It's an immediate attention director for it. And this is in a world today where more and more social scientists are being asked to produce not only work of high scholarly quality, but work which has a policy and practice impact. This kind of work is much more likely to achieve that impact attention. Not to say that the patterns in the process studies can't themselves be illuminating. By patterns in process studies, I mean a study which looks just at the patterns in a change process or the patterns in the decision making. These studies can be illuminating, but they also leave, well, so what questions? So what? You've found that there's a lot of political processes go on in decision making. So what? So patterns in process studies are not putting you off from doing these. They can be illuminating, but they still leave you with many so what questions. And of course, outcome studies have to be comparative. The research design is built on the notion is, first of all, you expose variation. Secondly, you explain variation. So it's straightforward, albeit challenging. So those are some of the and our final point on slide number 31. It's about the very important significance of mechanisms. And any process scholar who is trying to explain outcomes needs to be able to understand what mechanisms in the process are producing the outcomes. And Gerald Davis had a wonderful metaphor for explaining this. He said, if a regression tells us about a relationship between variables, if you wind a watch, you will keep running. Mechanisms pry the back of the watch and show us how it is running. So mechanisms are crucial. And of course, mechanisms describe sets of interacting parts or assembly of elements which produce an effect which are not inherent in any one of them. So mechanisms is all about cogs and wheels, the wheelwork of agency, as Gerald Davis suggests. And so his work on mechanisms, I would recommend you read. It's very, very valuable indeed. Well, I've come to the final part of my talk, and I've got, I should really finish in a couple of minutes. So let me just mention this final one. It's slide number 32, if we can put on. The final part of my presentation is the newest work that we've been trying to do. And again, this is teamwork, not done this time in a research center, but collaboration between scholars in different universities. And this is work which is being done by Joanne Murphy, David Denyer, and myself. And if you look, since I'm not going to have much time to explain this work, if you look at the British Journal of Management, volume 32 in 2021, you'll see a paper there written by the three of us, which discusses system-wide changes and the role of frame breaking in the development of system-wide changes, and more importantly, gives an example of a successful system-wide change. And the successful one we use, and this was only possible because of Joanne Murphy's fantastic fieldwork she's done in the north of Ireland. It's a study of the Northern Ireland conflict and peace process. So those of you who are interested in system-wide changes, and by the way, if we move on to the next slide, which is number 33, you'll see the examples of what I mean by system-wide change. Climate change, which of course is talked all the time these days, poverty reduction, another big theme in society, delivering health and social care in an aging society, critical problem in most Western or so-called developed societies today, and one that many people are very much concerned about. So these are big examples of system-wide change. And if you look at the example that I give in the study here, well, actually, let's move on to number 34. And you see something about the analytical character. What is it about these system-wide changes which makes them very difficult? First of all, they involve multiple, diverse, and geographically dispersed stakeholders. They're a very, very complex set of interest groups involved, who are multiple, who are diverse. They're often geographically dispersed, and they're often with these dispersed stakeholders often have divergent. Sorry about that. That was the phone going off there. It didn't disturb me too much. What I was trying to argue here, well, what are some of the analytical character of these system-wide changes? And I was saying the second one, of course, is that not only you've got complexity in terms of who's involved, the who's involved are also got quite divergent interests and values. And therefore, and also there are diffused power systems. There's no central power system there to manage this process. They're highly diffused power systems. And of course, many of them, these changes often have energy sapping histories of failure. So these are very, very challenging indeed. And it's very difficult to manage these changes in any kind of successful way. And moving on, you can see the next slide. You can see that the two big analytical practical challenges of these system-wide changes are, first of all, to mobilize cooperation. In other words, how do you mobilize cooperation in amongst that degree of political, structural, cultural, and geographical complexity? Huge problem. And secondly, how do you deliver contextually appropriate collective action to achieve additive change outcomes? In other words, even in these complex processes, there is often some progress in mobilizing cooperation, but it never leads to a great deal of contextually appropriate collective action. So I'd like to suggest, if you want to see some examples of a successful of change of this sort, you might look, and they're very rare. I mean, it's obviously very rare to find any kind of studies of system-wide change at the moment. But if you look at the British Journal of Management, volume 32, 2021, you'll see that there's a good example there of a successful change process with some very strong data supporting it. Well, I think I haven't quite finished there, but I think it's just after 3 o'clock, and it's probably be good if I stopped here. And if any of you have some questions, I'll very much like to attempt to answer them.